The bell above the door jingled at 11:47 p.m., and Lucia Moretti, no relation to the man who would soon try to ruin her life, didn't even look up from the coffee pot she was refilling. Lou's all-night diner had a way of pulling in every lonely soul in Brooklyn after midnight, and by now she could tell a lot about a customer just from the sound of the bell. This one sounded expensive. She was wrong about the name. Her last name was actually Bianchi, but she was right about the money. 4 men walked in, and the air in the diner changed before anyone said a word. 3 of them wore dark suits cut too well for a place that served eggs at 2 a.m. The 4th was old, maybe 80, wearing a cardigan buttoned wrong and slippers instead of shoes, his eyes darting around like he didn't know how he'd gotten there. Lucia had worked doubles for 3 years. She'd learned to read a room the way sailors read weather. "Table by the window," one of the suited men said, not asking. Lucia grabbed 4 menus anyway, because Frank, the manager, would dock her tips if she gave attitude to a paying table, no matter how rude they were. The old man wouldn't sit. He stood by the booth, gripping the edge of the table, his whole body trembling. The jukebox in the corner, an ancient thing Frank refused to fix properly, was skipping on a scratched record, the sound looping in a jagged electric whine. "No, please," said the youngest of the 4, a broad-shouldered man with dark, tired eyes and a jaw clenched so tight Lucia thought his teeth might crack. "Sit down, it's just music." But the old man wasn't hearing him. His breathing had gone shallow and fast, his hands were shaking, and he'd started muttering words in a language none of the bodyguards understood, his eyes wet and wide, somewhere far away from this diner, far away from Brooklyn entirely. "Marco, he's getting worse," one of the bodyguards muttered. So that was his name, Marco. He looked like he was maybe 28, and he looked like a man who was used to fixing things by making a phone call or making a threat. And right now, neither of those things was working. Lucia didn't know who these men were. She didn't care. She only knew an old man in pain when she saw one, and she'd spent 4 years in foster care with a woman who used to shake like that, at the end, when her mind wandered somewhere Lucia couldn't follow. She set down her coffee pot and walked over before she could talk herself out of it. "Signora," Marco snapped, stepping in front of her like she was a threat. "This isn't—" "I just want to help him," Lucia said quietly, and something in her voice made Marco pause. Maybe it was that she didn't sound scared of him. Almost nobody didn't sound scared of him. She stepped past his shoulder, slow, non-threatening, and kneeled slightly so she was eye-level with the old man. She poured a small cup of warm chamomile tea from the pot she always kept on the back burner. Frank thought it was a waste of gas, but Lucia liked having something gentle to offer people who looked like they needed gentleness. And then she spoke. Not English. Not the Italian you'd hear in a movie, all rolling R's and dramatic hands. Something older, rougher. A dialect scraped together from lullabies a woman named Carmela used to sing to her in a cramped apartment in Bensonhurst, back when Lucia was 8 years old and had nobody else in the world. "Calma, u cori, u marino è vicino." Calm your heart, the sea is near. The old man's entire body went still. His eyes, which had been darting and wild, found Lucia's face and locked there. The tremor in his hands slowed, then stopped. Tears welled up, spilled down the deep lines of his cheeks, and his mouth opened in something between a gasp and a sob. "Sophia," he whispered. The bodyguards exchanged glances. Marco went pale. "Sophia, amore mio, you came back," the old man said, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch Lucia's cheek. "I told them you would come back. I told them." Lucia had no idea who Sophia was, but she understood grief, and she understood being mistaken for someone lost, so she let him hold her hand, and she didn't correct him. And she kept humming the same soft melody until his breathing slowed to something normal, something peaceful, something almost like sleep standing up. Marco stared at her like she'd performed a magic trick he didn't believe in. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrow, calculating in a way that made her stomach twist. This wasn't gratitude on his face. It was suspicion. "Who are you?" he asked, low and sharp, pulling his wallet from his jacket like he intended to pay her off, or worse, find out exactly who had sent her.
"How do you know that dialect? Who told you to say that?"
"Nobody told me anything," Lucia said, straightening up, suddenly aware of how small she felt under his stare.
"I'm just a waitress. I didn't mean any harm."
But Marco Falcone didn't look like a man who believed in coincidences, and Lucia didn't know it yet, standing there in her stained apron with an old man's tears drying on her hand, but she'd just stepped into something far bigger than a late shift at a diner, something with a name attached to it that came with power, danger, and a past she didn't even know was hers to inherit. The old man, still holding her hand, finally closed his eyes and murmured one more thing before sleep took him standing there against the booth. "Don't leave me again." Vincenzo slept for 2 days straight after that night at the diner. Marco Falcone sat by his grandfather's bed for most of it, watching the old man's chest rise and fall in slow, peaceful rhythm. No thrashing, no confused shouting in the dark, no calling out for a dead woman at 3 a.m., the way he had almost every night for the past year. The doctors had tried sedatives. They hadn't worked half as well as a stranger's voice in a diner. Marco didn't like things he couldn't explain. He'd spent his whole life learning to explain things, how to read a balance sheet, how to read a room, how to read a man's face right before he lied to you. But he couldn't explain the waitress. So, on the 3rd day, he sent a car. Lucia had never seen a Bentley outside of a magazine, and she certainly hadn't expected one waiting outside her apartment building in Bensonhurst at 9 in the morning, the driver holding the door open like she was someone important. She almost told him he had the wrong address. Then she remembered the old man's tears on her hand and understood, with a small drop in her stomach, that this was exactly the right address. The Falcone estate sat on the Upper East Side behind a wrought iron gate, the kind of house that made Lucia feel like she should apologize for the scuff marks on her shoes before she even stepped inside. Marco met her in a study lined with dark wood shelves, standing instead of sitting, arms crossed, looking at her the way you'd look at a locked door you didn't have the key to. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, just certain. She sat. "I want to hire you," Marco said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Companion contract. You'd come here daily, spend time with my grandfather. Whatever you did at that diner, do it again. I'll pay you 3 times what you make waiting tables." Lucia opened the folder, and her eyes caught the number at the bottom of the page. Her mouth went dry. It was more than she made in 2 months. "Why?" she asked, because something about this felt wrong. Too easy, too fast. "Because for 2 days he's slept without screaming," Marco said, and for just a second, something cracked in his controlled expression. Something that looked almost like exhaustion, almost like love. He covered it fast. "And because I don't understand how a waitress from Brooklyn speaks a dialect that's been dead in my family for 60 years. And there it was, the real reason for the car, the study, the number on the page. "You think I'm lying," Lucia said quietly. "I think," Marco said, leaning forward, his voice dropping into something colder, "that a man named Moretti has spent the last year trying to find cracks in my family, and I think it would be very convenient for someone to plant a woman who speaks my grandfather's dead wife's dialect, gain his trust, and gain mine." Lucia felt her face go hot, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to anger. "You think I planned this? I didn't even know your name until your bodyguard said it." "Convince me," Marco said. So she did. She told him about growing up, bounced between 4 different foster homes before she turned 12, about the one home that had actually felt like a home, an elderly Sicilian immigrant named Carmela, who'd taken in foster kids but ended up treating them like her own. Carmela used to sing in a language Lucia didn't understand as a child. Words about the sea and calm hearts and coming home. Songs from a coastal village she'd left behind 60 years before and never stopped missing.
She died when I was 16, Lucia said. I still remember the songs. That's it. That's the whole terrible secret.
Marco said nothing, his eyes searching her face for the lie he was sure was there. Lucia reached into her bag. She'd brought it on instinct, not knowing why until this exact moment, and pulled out a worn photo album, its cover cracked with age. She slid it across the desk. That's her, Carmela. That's the village behind her in that photo, the one with the cliffs. She used to say it was the most beautiful place on earth and she'd never see it again. Lucia's voice caught, just slightly. I don't know why your grandfather called me Sophia. I don't know who Sophia is, but I know Carmela's songs, word for word, because they're the only thing anyone ever gave me that felt like it was mine. Marco picked up the album with careful hands, flipping through pages of a woman he'd never met, a village he recognized instantly, a coastline that matched the one his grandfather used to paint from memory before his hands got too unsteady to hold a brush. Something shifted behind his eyes. Suspicion didn't disappear completely. A man like Marco didn't let go of caution that easily, but underneath it, something else was surfacing. Lucia was watching a wall crack in real time, and she wasn't sure what she felt watching it happen. Relief, maybe, or something more dangerous than relief. I'm sorry, Marco said finally, and it seemed to cost him something to say it. For what it's worth, you didn't deserve to be interrogated like a suspect. You had reason to be careful, Lucia admitted. I'd be careful too, in your position. He studied her a moment longer than the conversation required, and Lucia felt her pulse pick up under that stare, an unfamiliar warmth crawling up her neck that had nothing to do with the Mafia, the Dialect, or the dead woman named Sophia. I'll double the offer, Marco said abruptly, looking away first, sliding a revised number across the desk like it was easier than looking at her. For your trouble. Lucia thought of her foster mother's medical bills, the debt collectors who called during her shifts, the apartment she could barely afford on a waitress's tips. She thought too of Vincenzo's tear-streaked face, calling her by a dead woman's name. Okay, she said, quieter than she meant to. I'll do it. Neither of them knew yet how much that single word would cost them both, or how much it would give them. The gown arrived 2 days before the gala, delivered in a garment bag so heavy Lucia needed both arms to carry it. Emerald green, floor length, the kind of dress that belonged on someone thinner, someone born into rooms like the one she was about to walk into. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror the night before, turning sideways, sucking in a breath she couldn't hold forever, and wondered if Marco had made a mistake asking her to come at all. You look beautiful, said the stylist Marco had sent, a brisk woman named Renata who'd spent 2 hours on Lucia's hair and hadn't once commented on her size, which Lucia noted with quiet gratitude. Not everyone was that kind. The plaza's grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers and old money. 300 guests in tuxedos and diamonds gathered for a hospital charity gala that Marco's family had sponsored for 2 generations. Lucia arrived on Vincenzo's arm, the old man dapper in a pressed suit, calmer than she'd seen him in the weeks she'd spent by his side. Marco walked a step behind them both, sharp in black tie, scanning the room the way he scanned every room, for threats, for weaknesses, for anyone who might be watching too closely. He didn't have to look far. The whispers started before Lucia had even handed off her coat. Who is she? A woman murmured behind a raised champagne flute, not quietly enough. Some kind of nurse? I heard she's the grandfather's companion, another voice answered. Falcone hired the help to babysit, and now he's parading her around like she belongs here. Lucia kept her spine straight and her smile fixed, the way she'd learned to during 1,000 rude tables at Lou's diner. But this was different. Rude customers left after they finished their coffee. This room was going to watch her for hours, weigh every bite she took, every seam of her dress that strained a little too much at the shoulder. She caught her reflection in a gilded mirror across the room, a full-figured woman in emerald green, surrounded by women built like pencils, and for one terrible second, she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Then a voice cut through the room, sharp and deliberately loud.
Falcone. A silver-haired man approached, cigar unlit between two fingers, eyes flicking dismissively over Lucia before landing on Vincenzo.
Good God, is that your grandfather? I heard he'd gone completely soft in the head. Can't hold a conversation, can he? Shame. What happens to a man's legacy when his mind goes before his body? The room around them quieted, listening, hungry for a scene. Marco's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist at his side. But before he could respond, Lucia stepped forward, chin lifted, voice calm and clear. "Actually," she said, "Don Vincenzo was just telling me about the founding of the Sant'Agata Hospital Wing in 1962, the one this very gala was created to honor. He remembers the exact donation figures. Do you?" The silver-haired man blinked, caught completely off guard. "He also mentioned," Lucia continued, sweetly, mercilessly, "that the man who tried to block that donation on the board was your father. Something about wanting the money for a yacht instead. I'm sure that's just old family gossip, though. Memory can be unreliable in old age." She smiled. Then again, apparently so can manners in the present. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd that had gathered. The silver-haired man's face went a shade of red that clashed badly with his cummerbund, and he retreated toward the bar without another word. Marco stared at her, like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. Not the waitress, not the possible spy, not the dialect-speaking mystery, but a woman who had just, with nothing but memory and nerve, defended his grandfather's honor in front of half of Manhattan's old money. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly, once they'd stepped away. "Your grandfather told me the story last week," Lucia said. "He remembers everything from before 1990 with perfect clarity. It's only the recent years that get tangled." She shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "I just listen to him. Nobody else really does." Marco didn't say anything for a moment. Then he offered her his arm, in front of everyone, in a room that had spent the last hour deciding she didn't belong. "Dance with me," he said. They moved to the balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue as the orchestra shifted into something slow, string-heavy, old-fashioned. City lights blurred gold beyond the railing. Lucia's heart hammered against the tight seam of her gown, half convinced this was some elaborate test she hadn't passed yet. "I owe you an apology," Marco said, his hand warm against her waist. "Not just for tonight, for assuming you were dangerous the moment I met you. You've done nothing but bring peace into a house that's had none in years." "You don't owe me anything," Lucia said. "I took the job for the money. I should be thanking you." "Don't do that," Marco said, more sharply than he meant to, then softened. "Don't shrink yourself down to a paycheck. I've watched you with my grandfather. I've watched you tonight, standing in a room full of people who think their opinion of you matters. It doesn't. Not to me." Lucia looked up at him, and for the first time since the diner, she let herself really look. Not at the Mafia Boss, not at the impossible wealth, but at a tired, guarded man who was, in this one unguarded moment, looking back at her like she was something rare. "Marco," she started, unsure what she meant to say next. He didn't let her finish the sentence. He simply held her closer as the music swelled, and for a few stolen minutes on that balcony, above a city that had already decided who she was and where she belonged, Lucia let herself believe none of that mattered. That maybe, impossibly, she'd just stumbled into a story much bigger than the one she thought she was living. Neither of them noticed the man in the dark coat standing near the ballroom entrance, watching the whole exchange with a phone already lifted to his ear. The Falcone shipping yard sat at the edge of the Brooklyn waterfront, a relic from a different era. Cranes rusted at the joints, warehouses stamped with a family name that had once meant something different than what it meant now. Marco came here twice a month, more out of loyalty than necessity, since the shipping business barely turned a profit anymore against the family's other, quieter interests.
But Vincenzo had built this yard with his own hands 60 years ago, back before slippers and forgotten names, and walking its docks seemed to steady something in him.
"He likes the smell of the salt air," Marco explained to Lucia as they walked the length of the pier, Vincenzo a few steps ahead, humming something under his breath that Lucia recognized. One of Carmela's old lullabies, the melody carried on wind off the harbor. "Reminds him of home, I think, even when he can't remember why." It should have been a quiet morning. Vincenzo pointing at gulls, Marco reviewing shipping manifests with his foreman, Lucia trailing behind with a thermos of chamomile tea in case the noise of the cranes overwhelmed the old man, the way the jukebox once had. Then a black car rolled through the gate uninvited, and everything changed. "Signor Moretti," Marco said, and the warmth drained instantly from his voice.
The man who stepped out was younger than Lucia expected. Sharp-suited, silver at the temples, flanked by 2 lawyers carrying leather folios like weapons. Lucia recognized the surname immediately from the whispers at the gala. Not the man from the ballroom, his associate apparently, and by the look on Marco's face, a far more dangerous one. "Marco, Marco," Moretti said, spreading his arms like they were old friends. "I hear congratulations are in order. Grandpa's got a new nurse. Very touching." "Say what you came to say," Marco said flatly. Moretti's smile didn't reach his eyes. He nodded to one of his lawyers, who stepped forward and opened a folio with theatrical slowness.
"This shipping yard," the lawyer began, "operates under a maritime lease agreement originally signed in 1950 between your grandfather, Vincenzo Falcone, and the Port Authority. Under Clause 11 of that agreement, in the event the original signatory becomes, how should I put this delicately, mentally incapacitated, operational control reverts to a court-appointed trustee." He paused for effect. "We've already filed the petition. My client would be happy to serve as that trustee, given his controlling interest in the adjacent dockland." Marco's face had gone the color of stone. Lucia watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, the same way they had at the gala, except this time there was no clever remark to throw, no room full of witnesses to shame Moretti into silence. This was a legal document, and legal documents didn't care about honor.
"That clause is airtight," the second lawyer added smoothly. "We've had it reviewed by 3 separate firms." Lucia felt her stomach drop, not for herself, but watching Marco's composure crack at the edges, watching Vincenzo standing a few feet away, oblivious to the storm swirling around him, still humming softly at the gulls overhead. And then, something in the lawyer's phrasing snagged in Lucia's memory. Clause 11, 1950, Port Authority. She'd read those exact words before, not in a legal textbook, but in Carmela's old photo album, tucked behind a faded photograph of the coastal village. Carmela's father had worked the docks in Sicily before immigrating, and she'd kept a copy of an old maritime agreement as a keepsake, something she used to read aloud to Lucia in that same archaic dialect, explaining each clause like a bedtime story about the old country's strange, formal laws. "Wait," Lucia said quietly, stepping forward before she could stop herself. Every head turned toward her. Moretti's smile flickered with something between amusement and irritation. "And who is this?" he asked. "That maritime agreement," Lucia said, ignoring him, addressing Marco directly. "The language in Clause 11. It's not just legal English, is it? The original 1950 lease would have referenced older Sicilian maritime code for renewal terms. My foster grandmother had a copy of a similar contract from the same era. There was a sunset provision. Automatic expiration of incapacity clauses after 40 years, unless formally renewed by the original signatory or a direct blood heir before the deadline." The lawyer's confident expression faltered. That provision was archaic, obscure. It wouldn't apply here." "Wouldn't it?" Lucia said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Because if it does apply, Then Clause 11 expired in 1990, 36 years ago, which means your entire filing is based on a clause that no longer exists. Silence settled over the dock, broken only by the distant cry of gulls and the low hum of Vincenzo's lullaby. Moretti's lawyers exchanged a look Lucia recognized instantly. Not confidence, but doubt. "We'll need to verify that," the first lawyer said stiffly. "Do that," Marco said, his voice returning with sharp, sudden authority, the earlier crack in his composure sealed shut. "And when you find out she's right, and she is right, you can explain to a judge why you filed a fraudulent petition against a man with dementia based on outdated maritime law. I'm sure that'll play wonderfully in front of the press." Moretti's jaw tightened, his charm evaporating into something colder. He looked at Lucia for a long, calculating moment, the kind of look that made her skin crawl, like he was filing her away as a problem to solve later. "Interesting company you keep, Marco," he said finally, turning back toward his car. "A waitress who moonlights as a maritime lawyer. How resourceful." The black car pulled away, gravel crunching under its tires, and only once it was through the gate did Marco finally let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the moment Moretti arrived. "How did you know that?" he asked, turning to Lucia, something like awe cutting through the last of his tension. "I didn't know it," Lucia admitted, her hands still shaking. "I remembered it. There's a difference." Marco studied her for a long moment, the harbor wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, and something settled behind his eyes. Not suspicion this time, not calculation, something closer to certainty. "You're not just a comfort to my grandfather," he said quietly. "You're the sharpest mind in this yard, and everyone here just watched you dismantle Moretti with a memory and a photo album." Lucia opened her mouth to deflect the compliment, the way she always did, but before she could, Vincenzo turned from the water's edge, his eyes suddenly clear, sharp, present in a way they rarely were anymore. "Sophia always did know how to make the sharks swim away," the old man said softly, smiling at Lucia like he'd just watched a memory replay itself in front of him. "Marco, don't let this one go." 2 weeks after the confrontation at the docks, Marco decided the city needed to disappear for a while. "He does better outside the noise," Marco said, loading a small suitcase into the trunk of his car while Vincenzo settled into the back seat, already humming happily at the prospect of a drive. The country house in the Hudson Valley was Sophia's favorite place. "I thought maybe it would be good for all of us." Lucia didn't ask what he meant by all of us. She'd stopped pretending, at least to herself, that this had ever been just a job. They left Manhattan behind before noon, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror as the highway opened into green hills and quiet water. Vincenzo fell asleep within 20 minutes, his head tipped against the window, more peaceful than Lucia had ever seen him. For the first time since she'd met Marco Falcone, there were no bodyguards trailing the car, no lawyers waiting with folios, no whispers from strangers deciding who she was allowed to be. Just open road and windows cracked to let in the smell of cut grass and river water. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Marco said, eyes on the road, one hand loose on the wheel. Lucia looked over at him, surprised by the sudden intimacy of the question. "That's a big ask for a car ride." "We've got 2 hours," he said. "Humor me." So she did. She told him about the year she was 10, moved to her 3rd foster home, how she used to hide under the stairwell of the building with a flashlight and read library books because it was the only place that felt like it was hers. She told him she used to imagine that somewhere out there was a version of her life where she belonged to somebody, permanently, without a case number attached to her name. "I used to think that dream was embarrassing," she admitted, "wanting to belong somewhere so badly, like it made me weak." "It doesn't," Marco said, quiet and certain. "It makes you human. I spent my whole life surrounded by more people than I could count, bodyguards, cousins, business associates crawling all over the estate, and I don't think I ever once felt like I belonged to any of it. Just a piece of machinery my father was grooming to replace him." He paused. "My mother died when I was 6. My father never really recovered from it.
Vincenzo was the only one who ever looked at me like I was a person and not an investment. "And now you're the head of that machinery," Lucia said gently. "Now I'm terrified I'll run it into the ground and disappoint the only person who ever believed in me," Marco said, and the honesty of it startled them both into a comfortable, aching silence. They stopped at a roadside farm stand an hour later, wooden crates stacked with sunflowers and peaches, an old dog sleeping in a patch of shade. Vincenzo woke just as they pulled in, delighted by the flowers, insisting they buy an armful of them for Sophia's table, and neither Marco nor Lucia corrected him. While Vincenzo wandered the crates of peaches with the farm owner's granddaughter, laughing at something only the two of them understood, Marco bought a small bundle of wildflowers from the stand and turned to Lucia with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Soft, almost shy, none of the guarded control that usually lived behind his eyes. "These are for you," he said, holding them out. "Not for a photo op, not for a gala, just because I wanted to give you something, and flowers were what was here." Lucia took them, her fingers brushing his, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with grief or gratitude. "Marco," she started, unsure what came next. He reached out and took her hand instead of waiting for the rest of the sentence, his thumb brushing slowly over her knuckles, and for the first time since she'd met him, Marco Falcone looked less like a man who ran an empire, and more like a man who was simply, quietly, falling. "I don't do this," he admitted. "I don't let people close. It's not safe in my world to want things too much. Wanting things gives people leverage against you." "And now?" Lucia asked. "Now I think I've wanted this for weeks and pretended it was something else," Marco said. "Gratitude, curiosity, anything safer than the truth." "Which is?" He didn't answer with words. He simply held her hand the rest of the way back to the car, and something unspoken settled between them. Not yet a confession, but the shape of one, waiting for the right moment to arrive. They drove the last stretch to the estate in a comfortable quiet, Vincenzo humming in the back seat, wildflowers resting in Lucia's lap, the Hudson River catching the late afternoon light like something out of a painting. Watching them in the rearview mirror, Vincenzo's eyes, clear, present, unclouded for once by the fog that usually claimed him, softened with something like recognition. "You found her again," the old man murmured, mostly to himself, watching Marco's hand still resting over Lucia's on the center console. "I told you the sea always brings her back, Marco. I told you." Marco caught his grandfather's eyes in the mirror and didn't correct him this time either. Something about the moment, the flowers, the quiet, the warmth of Lucia's hand under his, made the old man's confusion feel less like a symptom and more like a strange kind of prophecy, one Marco wasn't sure he wanted to argue with anymore. Lucia looked out at the hills rolling past the window, her heart full and terrified in equal measure, and thought about how strange it was that a life she'd once measured in double shifts and unpaid bills had somehow led her here, to wildflowers and a dangerous man's careful hands and an old man's certainty that some loves were simply meant to find their way home, no matter how many years or lifetimes stood in the way. She didn't yet know that the peace of this drive was the calm before every storm that was coming for them both. The storm rolled in just after dinner, thunder cracking low over the hills before the rain even started, and by 9 o'clock the power had gone out across the entire estate. "It happens every summer," Marco said, moving through the darkened halls with the easy familiarity of someone who'd spent childhood summers memorizing every creaking floorboard. "The lines out here are older than I am. Vincenzo's asleep already. The storm doesn't bother him the way it used to." He found candles in a kitchen drawer, and within minutes the grand library glowed with warm, flickering light, shelves of leather-bound books rising into shadow above them. Rain lashed against the tall windows in steady sheets. Lucia sat curled into a worn leather armchair by the unlit fireplace,
while Marco knelt and coaxed a fire to life from kindling stacked beside the hearth, sparks catching slowly until flame took hold. "This was Sophia's favorite room," Marco said, settling onto the rug near the fire, close enough that Lucia could feel the warmth radiating off him, separate from the fire entirely. "Vincenzo used to read to her here every night, apparently. My father told me once that this whole estate was built around this room. Everything else came later." Lucia looked around at the shelves, the worn spines of books that had survived decades, and felt something loosen in her chest. The safety of the space pulling honesty out of her the way warm tea used to pull confessions from Vincenzo. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Something embarrassing?" "You already told me the stairwell story," Marco said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "I think we're past embarrassing." Lucia laughed, but it faded quickly into something more vulnerable. "That night at the gala, all those women whispering. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was there for Vincenzo, not for them." She pulled her knees up to her chest, staring into the fire instead of at him. "But it did matter. It mattered because some small, stupid part of me has spent my whole life believing rooms like that weren't built for people who look like me. That I'd always be the outsider looking in, no matter how smart I was or how hard I tried." Marco was quiet for a moment, watching the fire cast shifting light across her face. "I grew up in those rooms," he said slowly, "and I can tell you, most of the people in them are hollow. They inherited seats at tables they never earned, wearing confidence like a costume because it's easier than actually having something to say. You walked into that ballroom and dismantled a man with nothing but memory and grace, and every person in that room knew it, even the ones who wouldn't admit it." He turned to face her fully. "You don't owe that room your insecurity, Lucia. If anything, that room owes you an apology for taking this long to notice you." "It's not just the gala," Lucia admitted, her voice smaller now, the fire crackling in the silence between her words. "It's everywhere. My whole life, I've been the girl nobody chose first, the extra placement nobody wanted to take in, the waitress customers looked past to order their coffee. I've spent so long making myself small and useful so people would have a reason to keep me around. And some days I look at you, at all of this, and I think, why would someone like you ever choose someone like me? Not because I need reassurance, because I genuinely don't understand it." Marco reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and gently turned her face toward his, with 2 fingers beneath her chin. "Then let me be very clear," he said, his voice low and steady, none of the guarded coldness she'd first met at the diner. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My name, my money, my influence. You are the first person who has ever looked at me like I was just a man. Not an heir, not a boss. Just Marco." His thumb brushed gently along her cheekbone. "Your grace isn't despite anything, Lucia. It never needed an apology, and it never needed to earn a place in any room. You are, without question, the most extraordinary person I have ever known. And I don't say that lightly, because I don't say it at all, to anyone." Lucia's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected, the weight of years of quiet self-doubt suddenly, gently, being set down. "I've been so afraid to want this," she whispered, "because wanting things this much has never once gone well for me." "Then let it go well this time," Marco said softly. "Let me be the exception." He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every second to stop him if she wanted to. And when she didn't, when instead she leaned in to meet him, their first kiss was soft and unhurried. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, only offered. The fire crackled beside them, rain drummed steady against the windows, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the world outside the two of them simply ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, Marco rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathless in the quiet, golden dark. "I don't know what this is," Lucia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or what it means, given everything. Your family, your world, all of it." "I don't have all the answers either," Marco said. "But I know I haven't felt this steady in years. And I know it started the moment you walked into that diner and stopped my grandfather from drowning in a memory he couldn't escape." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, tender in a way that undid her completely. "Whatever this is, Lucia, I don't want to let it go." Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the firelit library, wrapped in each other and the quiet certainty of something new and terrifying and real, neither of them noticed, nor could they have known, that somewhere back in the city, a corrupted board director was already signing papers that would try to tear everything Marco had built completely apart. They returned to the city 4 days later, sun-warmed and reluctant, Vincenzo humming contentedly in the back seat about wildflowers and rivers. The peace lasted exactly 6 hours. Gio, Marco's head of security, met them at the estate gate with a face that told Marco everything before he said a single word. "Warren pulled an emergency board vote. He's got the numbers to force it through by end of week." Marco's jaw tightened. Warren Ashcroft, the Falcone family's longest-serving board director, a man who'd sat at Vincenzo's right hand for 30 years, who'd bounced Marco on his knee at company Christmas parties. If Warren had turned, the situation was worse than Marco had let himself imagine. "What's the vote?" Marco asked, already moving toward his study, Lucia trailing behind with Vincenzo's arm looped through hers. "No confidence," Gio said grimly. "They're saying you're too young, too distracted, that your judgment's been compromised lately by—" He hesitated, glancing at Lucia with something like an apology in his eyes. "Personal matters." Lucia felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately. This wasn't just about Marco's leadership. This was about her. The board meeting was called for the following afternoon, an emergency session in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above Wall Street. 12 directors seated around a table that had decided the fate of Falcone Enterprises for 3 generations. Marco walked in with his spine straight and his face unreadable. But Lucia, watching from the doorway, holding Vincenzo's arm, could feel the tension radiating off him like heat off asphalt. Warren Ashcroft stood first, silver-haired and composed, a folder of documents in front of him like a man who'd rehearsed this exact moment. "Gentlemen," Warren began, "we've watched Marco struggle these past months. Erratic judgment, unvetted personal associates given unprecedented access to sensitive family matters." His eyes flicked briefly toward the doorway, toward Lucia, and something cold settled in her chest. "A leadership crisis of this magnitude requires decisive action. I'm calling a formal vote of no confidence in Marco Falcone's continued role as head of this company." Murmurs rippled around the table. A few directors exchanged uneasy glances. Marco stood, calm on the surface, though Lucia could see his hands pressed flat against the table, knuckles white. "Before anyone votes," Marco said evenly, "I'd like to understand exactly what erratic judgment Warren is referring to. Specific examples, not innuendo." "The shipping yard incident," Warren said smoothly. "Moretti's legal team reports you brought an unqualified civilian into a sensitive corporate negotiation. That's not judgment, Marco. That's recklessness." "That unqualified civilian," Marco said, voice sharpening, "correctly identified an expired maritime clause that saved this company $40 million in litigation. Perhaps if you'd reviewed the actual outcome instead of Moretti's version of events, you'd know that." Warren's composure flickered, just slightly, and it was that flicker, small, almost imperceptible, that made Lucia's instincts sharpen. She'd learned, over years of reading rude customers and unpredictable foster parents, to notice the exact moment someone's confidence became
performance. She stepped forward before she could stop herself, still holding Vincenzo's arm, a heavy leather satchel slung over her shoulder that she'd insisted on bringing without fully explaining why. "Mr. Ashcroft," Lucia said, and every head in the room turned toward her. 12 executives clearly startled that the unqualified civilian had chosen to speak at all. "May I ask how long you've worked with Falcone Shipping's Sicilian import contracts?" "That's hardly relevant," Warren said stiffly. "It's very relevant," Lucia said, setting the satchel on the table and unbuckling it with steady hands. "Because my foster grandmother, Carmela Ferraro, worked the dock archives in Palermo for 20 years before immigrating. She kept meticulous records, a habit, apparently, from a lifetime of watching men in expensive suits try to quietly move money when no one would look." She pulled out a stack of aged ledgers, their leather covers cracked with time, and laid them open on the table, revealing rows of careful, handwritten entries, shipping manifests, offshore account numbers, wire transfers routed through a shell company registered in the Caymans. "These are decades old," Lucia continued, flipping to a marked page. "But the account numbers match a pattern I noticed in this month's shipping ledgers I've been reviewing with Vincenzo most evenings, since he likes to reminisce about the old routes." She looked directly at Warren. "The same offshore account that received a payment last month labeled as a consulting fee from a shell company with ties to Signor Moretti. Would you like to explain that, Mr. Ashcroft, or should I?" The room went utterly silent. Warren's face drained of color. "This is absurd," he stammered. "Fabricated. The wire transfer dates match exactly with your calendar entries for private meetings with Moretti's associates," Marco said quietly, having pulled up the digital shipping records on his tablet while Lucia spoke, cross-referencing in real time. 3 meetings in the last 2 months, Warren, all logged as personal appointments." One of the other directors leaned forward, examining the ledgers with narrowed eyes. "He's been feeding Moretti our shipping schedules," the director said slowly, realization dawning. "That's how Moretti knew exactly when to file the buyout petition. He had inside information." Warren's composure shattered completely. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under." "I understand a man who sold out 60 years of family loyalty for a payoff," Marco said, his voice cold as steel now, all warmth gone. "Resign now, quietly, or I release every ledger in this room to the SEC by morning." Warren's hands trembled as he gathered his folder, defeated, the silence around the table thick with shock and something like awe as the remaining directors turned to look at Lucia. Really look at her, the way they hadn't bothered to before. "Who exactly is she?" one of the older directors asked Marco quietly, not unkindly, once Warren had fled the room in disgraced silence. Marco looked at Lucia standing beside Vincenzo, steady and composed, despite having just dismantled a 30-year board member in front of the company's entire leadership. "She's the reason this family still has a future," Marco said simply, and something in his voice made it clear to everyone in the room that he meant it in more ways than one. Vincenzo, quiet through the entire confrontation, finally spoke, patting Lucia's hand with a small, satisfied smile. "Sophia always did keep the ledgers better than the men who wrote them," he murmured, and this time, no one in the room questioned why. The board scandal made the papers within a week, carefully managed, thanks to Marco's PR team, framed as an internal corporate cleanup rather than the near collapse it had actually been. But privately, in the quiet of the estate, Marco found himself thinking less about the company he'd saved and more about the debt he owed the woman who'd saved it. "I want to take you both to Sicily," he said one evening, finding Lucia in the garden reading to Vincenzo from an old book of coastal folk tales. "Vincenzo hasn't seen the village since he left as a young man, and you—" he paused, searching for the right words. "You've spent your whole life holding pieces of a place you've never actually stood in. I want to give you the whole picture, not just fragments from a photo album." Vincenzo's eyes lit up at the word Sicily, more alert than Lucia had seen him in weeks, and that alone was enough to settle any hesitation she had about the trip. They flew out 10 days later on a private plane arranged through the family's shipping contacts, Vincenzo delighted by the window seat, pointing out clouds like a child on his first flight.
Lucia sat curled against the leather seat, unable to shake the nervous flutter building steadily in her chest as the hours stretched over the Atlantic. "You're quiet," Marco observed midway through the flight, reaching over to still her fidgeting hands with his own. "I've spent my whole life imagining this place," Lucia admitted. "Carmela's stories, the songs, the photographs. It became this perfect, mythical thing in my head. A home I never actually had." She looked out at the dark ocean below, moonlight scattered across the waves. "What if I get there and it's just a place? What if there's nothing waiting for me except disappointment?" "Or," Marco said gently, "what if it's everything you imagined and more, because this time you won't be standing there alone?" Lucia turned to look at him, and something about the steadiness in his eyes, none of the guarded calculation from the diner, none of the suspicion from that first interrogation in his study, settled the anxious flutter in her chest into something calmer. "I'm scared I won't fit in," she admitted. "That the villagers will take one look at me and know I don't belong there, no matter how many songs I remember." Marco reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box, and for one wild, heart-stopping second, Lucia thought, but no. He opened it to reveal a delicate gold pendant, engraved with her initials in careful, looping script, a small compass rose etched beside them. "Not a proposal," Marco said, catching the flash of surprise on her face and smiling faintly. "Not yet. Just something to remind you, wherever we go, that you belong to something now. To me, to Vincenzo, to whatever this is we're building together. You don't need the village's permission to belong anywhere, Lucia. You never did." He fastened the pendant around her neck himself, his fingers brushing the back of her neck with careful tenderness, and Lucia felt tears prick at her eyes. Not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming, unfamiliar sensation of being chosen, fully and without condition. "Whatever happens when we land," Marco said quietly, "I'll be standing right beside you, every step." Vincenzo, who had been dozing against the window, stirred at that moment and looked over at them both with a clarity that startled Lucia. No confusion in his expression, no fog, just a warm, knowing smile. "You sound just like I did," Vincenzo said softly. "The night I told Sophia's father I'd follow her anywhere, even if the whole village thought I was a fool for choosing a fisherman's daughter over the merchant's daughter my own father wanted for me." He reached over and patted Marco's knee affectionately. "Love doesn't ask the world's permission, boy. It only asks yours." The plane touched down in Palermo just as the sun broke over the horizon, gold light spilling across the tarmac and the distant hills beyond, and Lucia felt her breath catch at the sight of it. Mountains she'd only ever seen in a cracked photograph, the same coastline Carmela used to describe from memory with tears in her eyes. They stepped off the plane hand in hand, Vincenzo walking ahead with more energy than Lucia had seen from him in the entire time she'd known him, practically pulling them toward the waiting car like a man 20 years younger, drawn by some invisible thread back toward the place his whole life had once orbited around. "It smells the same," Vincenzo murmured, breathing in deep, eyes wet with something between grief and joy. 60 years, and it still smells exactly the same. The salt, the lemon trees. God, I'd forgotten how much I missed it. Lucia watched him, throat tight, and felt Marco's hand tighten around hers. "Ready?" he asked softly. She thought about Carmela, who never made it back to see this coastline again before she died. She thought about the little girl under the stairwell with a flashlight, dreaming of belonging somewhere permanent. She thought about the pendant resting warm against her collarbone, and the man beside her who'd fastened it there with such quiet certainty. "Ready," Lucia said, and meant it. The car pulled away from the airport, winding along a coastal road that curved above cliffs and turquoise water, and somewhere in the hills ahead waited a village Lucia had only ever known through songs and photographs, a village that, she was about to discover, already knew far more about her past than she could have ever imagined. Behind them, unnoticed in the crowd of the arrivals terminal,
A man in a dark coat lowered his phone after snapping a single photograph of the three of them walking hand in hand toward the car. A photograph that would, within hours, find its way to Signor Moretti's private email, along with a single message. They've arrived, awaiting instructions.
San Vito rose out of the cliffside like something carved by hand. Whitewashed houses stacked above turquoise water, narrow stone streets winding upward toward a square shaded by an ancient olive tree that looked older than the village itself. The moment their car crested the final hill and the village came into view, Vincenzo made a sound Lucia had never heard from him before. Half laugh, half sob, both hands pressed to his chest like he was holding his own heart in place. "It hasn't changed," he whispered. 60 years, and it hasn't changed at all. Word traveled fast in a village this small. By the time they parked near the square, a small crowd had already gathered. Older villagers drawn by whispers that Vincenzo Falcone, the boy who'd left for America decades ago, had finally come home. An elderly woman broke from the group first, hand pressed to her mouth, tears already falling. "Vincenzo, sei tu davvero? Is it really you?" What happened next left Lucia stunned into silence, as introductions rippled through the gathering crowd, as Vincenzo embraced cousins and childhood friends he hadn't seen in 6 decades. Lucia found herself greeting each person in the old dialect without thinking, the words rising to her lips as naturally as breathing. And one by one, the villagers' surprised, delighted expressions told her everything. This wasn't a dead language to them. It was simply home, and she was speaking it like she'd never left. "Ma come parla così?" an old fisherman asked, staring at Lucia with open wonder. "But how does she speak like that?" An elderly man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, tall despite his age, wearing a cardigan not unlike Vincenzo's own, a leather satchel of papers tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as Alfonso, the village's unofficial archivist, keeper of San Vito's records for nearly 50 years. "Come," Alfonso said, gesturing them toward the town hall, a small stone building at the edge of the square. "I think there is something you should all see. I received a call 2 days ago. Marco's assistant, asking about family records. I've been preparing since." Inside, the town hall smelled of dust and old paper, shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers dating back centuries. Alfonso pulled a specific volume from a locked cabinet, its pages yellowed and brittle, and laid it open on a long wooden table. "Sofia Bellini," he said, tapping a name inked in careful, faded script. "Vincenzo's late wife. Born here, in this village, in 1938. He turned several pages forward, tracing his finger down a column of names. "And here, her younger sister, Carmela Bellini, born 1941. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. "Carmela," she whispered. That was my foster grandmother's name." "There is more," Alfonso said gently, watching her face carefully. "Carmela emigrated to America in 1962, several years after her sister Sofia married Vincenzo. The records here note she left under difficult circumstances, a broken engagement, family shame, the kind of thing that sent so many young women away from villages like this one in those years. She never returned, never wrote, as far as the village records show. Until now, no one here knew what became of her." Marco's hand found Lucia's, gripping tight, both of them staring at the faded ink like it might rearrange itself into a different story. "So Carmela and Sofia were sisters," Lucia said slowly, working through the implications with a strange mixture of relief and something close to grief. Which means there is no blood between you and Marco," Alfonso confirmed, and something in the room seemed to exhale all at once. "You are not descended from Sofia. You are descended from her sister, a woman who left this village carrying nothing but heartbreak and a handful of songs she refused to forget, and who apparently passed every one of those songs down to a little girl in Brooklyn who needed a home."
He closed the ledger with something like reverence. "There is no blood bond here, signorina. But there is something rarer. A bond of honor between two sisters separated by an ocean, carried forward 60 years later by two people who never should have found each other at all, and somehow did." Vincenzo, who had been silent through the entire revelation, finally spoke, his voice thick with tears, his eyes clearer and more present than Lucia had ever seen them. "All this time," he said softly, "I thought I was losing my mind, calling you Sophia. But some part of me knew. Some part of me recognized her sister's blood in your voice before either of us understood why." He took Lucia's hands in both of his own, trembling but sure. "You are not my Sophia, but you carry her sister's heart, and that is a gift I never thought this old world owed me again." He turned to Marco, placing Lucia's hand deliberately into his grandson's, standing beneath the ancient olive tree in the square as the whole village watched, quiet and reverent. "I bless this," Vincenzo said simply. "Whatever comes next for you both, I bless it with everything I have left to give." Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Marco led Lucia away from the celebration, up a narrow cliffside path overlooking the Mediterranean, the water below burning gold and copper in the fading light. "I brought you somewhere quiet," he said, "because I wanted to ask you something without 300 wedding guests and a village archivist watching." Lucia turned, heart hammering, and found Marco already lowering himself onto one knee, a small box in his trembling hands. The second one she'd seen from him, though this one, she understood immediately, was not a pendant. "I spent my whole life building walls because I thought that was strength," Marco said, voice rough with emotion. "You walked through every single one of them without even trying, and you gave my grandfather back years of peace I thought were gone forever. And you gave me something I never let myself hope for." He opened the box, revealing a ring set with a single deep green stone that matched the gown she'd worn the night of the gala. "Build a new era with me, Lucia. Not because you saved my family, though God knows you did, but because I cannot imagine a single day of my future that doesn't have you standing in it." Lucia looked out at the endless blue of the sea her foster grandmother had never stopped missing, felt the pendant warm against her collarbone, and understood, with absolute certainty, that she had finally, impossibly, found her way home.
"Yes," she said, tears spilling freely now.
"Yes, Marco. 1,000 times yes."
News of the engagement spread through San Vito faster than the tide, and within days the Falcone family villa in Palermo, a sprawling estate overlooking the harbor, inherited from Vincenzo's own father decades ago, filled with preparations for an evening gathering to formally announce the union to the region's oldest families. Regional elders, distant cousins, and business associates from both continents were invited to witness Vincenzo's blessing made public. Lucia stood on the villa's terrace that evening in a simple ivory dress, the emerald ring catching torchlight as she greeted guests alongside Marco, feeling steadier in her own skin than she had in years. The photograph in the arrivals terminal, the man in the dark coat, the quiet unease that had followed them since Sicily, none of it had surfaced again, and Lucia had allowed herself, cautiously, to believe the danger had passed. She was wrong. Moretti arrived just as the evening reached its warmest hour, uninvited, flanked by two men Lucia didn't recognize, his expensive suit incongruous against the rustic elegance of the villa's courtyard. Conversation dimmed as heads turned toward the unexpected arrival, and Marco's hand found the small of Lucia's back instinctively, protective and tense. "Marco," Moretti said smoothly, raising a glass of wine he'd lifted from a passing tray, as though he'd been invited all along. "I couldn't let this occasion pass without paying my respects. An engagement, I hear. How charming." "You're not welcome here," Marco said flatly, his voice pitched low enough not to disturb the elders seated nearby, though his eyes had gone hard as flint.
"I've come a long way," Moretti said, ignoring him entirely, his gaze sliding instead toward Lucia with open, deliberate contempt. "All the way from New York, in fact, to settle the matter of your shipping contracts properly, since your board seems to have collapsed rather spectacularly in my absence." He took a slow sip of wine. "But I confess, I'm more curious about her." The courtyard had gone quiet now, regional elders and family friends alike watching the confrontation unfold, with the particular stillness of people who understood exactly how dangerous a public insult could become.
"A waitress," Moretti continued, addressing the gathered crowd now rather than Marco directly, his voice carrying deliberately across the courtyard. "From Brooklyn. No family name worth mentioning, no lineage, no claim to anything but a job serving coffee to strangers at midnight. And somehow she's convinced an old man with a failing mind that she's the reincarnation of his dead wife, wormed her way into a fortune, and now stands here, dressed like she belongs among people whose families have held honor in this region for 4 centuries. He turned back to Lucia, his smile sharp as a blade. "Tell me, signorina, does it not embarrass you, standing among true nobility, knowing you're nothing but an outsider playing dress-up in someone else's legacy?" Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Marco stepped forward, fury visible in every line of his body, but Lucia's hand on his arm stopped him before he could speak. "Let me," she said quietly.
She stepped forward instead, into the space Moretti had cleared for his insult, and when she spoke, it was not in English, and not in the modern Italian half the crowd expected. It was in the old coastal dialect, formal and precise, the same dialect the village elders themselves had grown up speaking. Words layered with the specific etiquette of Sicilian hospitality that had governed these families for centuries before Moretti's own fortune existed.
"Signor Moretti," she began, her voice carrying clear and steady across the stunned courtyard. "You speak of honor and lineage in a home that has welcomed you as a guest, yet you have arrived uninvited and insulted your host in front of the very elders whose respect you claim to value. In the old ways of this village, ways older than your family's money, older than any business empire, there is no greater disgrace than a man who abuses hospitality he was never even granted." She turned, deliberately, to address the regional elders seated at the head table, continuing in the same formal, flawless dialect. "I did not ask to be born without a family name. I did not choose the circumstances that left me without inheritance or lineage. But I have learned in this village that true honor was never about the blood in your veins. It was about the way you treat the people around you. Signor Moretti stands here judging my worth by an accident of birth, while showing none of the grace, none of the respect that this region has taught its children for generations. I ask you, elders, which of us has truly disgraced this house tonight?" Silence fell over the courtyard, thick and absolute, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the harbor below. Then, slowly, one of the eldest men at the head table, a stooped patriarch named Don Alessandro, whose family had held influence in the region since before Vincenzo's own birth, rose from his seat. "The girl speaks the old tongue better than half the men in this courtyard," Don Alessandro said, his voice carrying easily despite his age. "And she speaks the old truths better still." He turned his gaze on Moretti, cold and unforgiving. "You have insulted a guest of this house. In the old tongue you clearly do not understand well enough to recognize when it condemns you. In this region, Signor Moretti, that is not a small matter." One by one, the other elders rose as well, murmuring agreement, their expressions shifting from curiosity to open disapproval as they turned their backs, quite literally, on Moretti's stunned, reddening face. "This isn't over," Moretti hissed. But the words carried no weight now, no audience left willing to hear them. Within days, Lucia would later learn, the Regional Business Council, moved by the elders' public rebuke, voted unanimously to strip Moretti of his standing interests across 3 provinces, a decision that would cripple decades of his family's carefully built influence in the region. Vincenzo, who had watched the entire exchange from his seat near the head table, rose slowly and crossed the courtyard to stand beside Lucia, taking her hand in both of his eyes shining with unmistakable pride. "Sofia never had to raise her voice to win a war," he said softly, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "She simply reminded everyone what honor actually looked like." He kissed Lucia's knuckles gently. "You have done the same tonight, twice over." Marco pulled Lucia close as the courtyard slowly returned to celebration around them, murmurs of admiration replacing the earlier tension, and pressed his lips to her temple. "You just became a legend in 2 countries in the span of 1 conversation," he murmured against her hair. Lucia laughed, breathless and disbelieving, the adrenaline of the confrontation only now beginning to fade. "I just told the truth," she said, "in a language I never even knew was mine to claim, until it was." Above them, the Sicilian sky had turned a deep, star-scattered blue, and somewhere out past the harbor, the sea Carmela had never stopped missing rolled on, ancient and unbothered, exactly as it always had. The Cathedral of San Vito had stood on its cliffside perch for 600 years, its bells calling generations of the village's families to baptisms, funerals, and weddings long before anyone alive today had been born. On the morning of the wedding, those same bells rang out over the harbor with a warmth the old stones seemed to remember from decades past. The last time they'd rung this way, Alfonso the archivist told anyone who'd listen, had been for Vincenzo and Sofia themselves. Lucia stood in the small stone antechamber beside the cathedral's heavy wooden doors, and for a moment she allowed herself simply to breathe. The lace gown had been made by a seamstress in the village, 3 generations of the same family working the fabric by hand. Once Alfonso mentioned, quietly, that Sofia's own wedding dress had been sewn by that seamstress's grandmother in this very workshop. Lucia had cried when she was told, and cried again when the dress was finished, its intricate lace sleeves and modest, flattering silhouette making her feel, for the first time in her life, not like she was hiding her body, but like she was simply, finally, herself. "You look exactly like her," Vincenzo said, appearing at the antechamber door in a crisp linen suit, offering his arm since Lucia had no father to walk her down the aisle and had asked, with tears in her eyes, whether he would do her the honor instead. "Not in the face, in the way you carry yourself, like the whole world is worth being kind to, even when it hasn't always been kind to you." "Thank you for choosing me," Lucia said, "long before Marco ever did." "Sofia chose you first," Vincenzo said softly. "The moment I saw her sister's grief and her sister's love reflected back at me in a diner 6 months ago, drowning out a broken jukebox, I only had to catch up to what my heart already knew." The cathedral doors opened, and Lucia walked into golden afternoon light spilling through centuries-old stained glass, down an aisle packed with faces that had become, impossibly, her family. Village elders who'd once judged her worth by rumor now beaming with open pride. New York business associates who'd whispered cruelty at a plaza gala now watching in humbled silence. Alfonso dabbing his eyes near the front pew. Renata, the stylist who'd flown in specially, weeping openly into a handkerchief. And at the altar stood Marco, dressed in dark formal wear, his composed, guarded expression from their very first meeting completely gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded and entirely hers. "You once told me," Marco murmured, once Vincenzo had placed her hand in his and taken his own seat, "that you spent your whole life being the girl nobody chose first." His voice caught, thick with emotion the whole cathedral could hear. "I want the record to show, in front of God and every person who ever made you feel small, that I choose you first. Today, tomorrow, and every day this life gives us." The ceremony passed in a blur of old rites and older blessings, half in Italian, half in the coastal dialect that had brought them together. The priest, an old friend of Vincenzo's from before the war, smiling through the whole service like he understood he was witnessing something the village would tell stories about for generations. When Marco finally kissed his bride, the cathedral erupted into applause loud enough to send startled gulls scattering from the bell tower outside. The reception spilled into the cathedral's stone courtyard as the sun began its slow, spectacular descent toward the Mediterranean, long tables groaning under platters of local seafood and wine from vineyards the Falcone family had known for generations. Musicians tuned instruments beneath strings of warm lantern light, and children from the village ran laughing between the tables, while grandmothers called her Nostra Figlia, our daughter, as though she'd been born among these cliffs instead of finding her way here through grief, foster homes, and a stranger's forgotten lullabies. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in impossible shades of copper and rose, Marco led Lucia onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, the same slow, string-heavy melody that had played on the plaza's balcony all those months ago, when neither of them had understood yet what they were building.
"Do you remember?" Marco murmured against her ear as they swayed, "standing on that balcony, terrified I'd made some terrible mistake bringing you into my world?" "I remember," Lucia said, smiling against his shoulder. "I thought I'd disappoint every expectation the moment anyone really looked at me." "You didn't disappoint a single expectation," Marco said. "You exceeded every one I never even knew I had." He pulled back slightly to look at her, the last of the sunset gilding her face in gold. "You took a life built on cold calculation and suspicion, Lucia, and you filled it with warmth I thought I'd lost the capacity to feel. You gave my grandfather back years of peace. You gave this family its honor. And you gave me a heart I thought had gone hollow years ago. You transformed everything I am simply by refusing to let a diner full of rude strangers see you as anything less than exactly who you are." Lucia felt tears slip free, warm and unashamed, catching the last of the light like the sea below them. "You gave me a home," she whispered. "A real one, the kind I stopped believing existed after Carmela died. I used to think belonging was something you had to be born into. You taught me it's something you can simply choose over and over, every single day." At the head table, Vincenzo watched his grandson and new granddaughter sway together beneath the lantern light, the ancient olive tree standing sentinel just beyond the courtyard wall, its roots older than every family gathered here tonight. His eyes, clear and present in a way that had become steadily more common since the day a stranger's voice had calmed a broken jukebox's roar, filled with quiet tears. "Grazie, Sofia," he murmured, too soft for anyone but the evening breeze to catch, lifting his glass slightly toward the darkening sky above the sea. "Grazie per avermi mandato tua sorella, quando ne avevo più bisogno. Thank you for sending me your sister when I needed her most." Below the cliffs, the Mediterranean rolled on exactly as it had for centuries, patient, eternal, indifferent to fortunes won and lost, to families broken and rebuilt, to the small, improbable miracle of a waitress from Brooklyn who had walked into a diner one ordinary night and, without ever meaning to, found her way completely, finally, home. And as the music swelled and the lanterns flickered gold against the coming stars, the Falcone legacy, battered, tested, and ultimately unbreakable, danced on into whatever bright, uncertain future still lay ahead, together, exactly as it was always meant to.